Hello everyone, today I'm going to show you for the first time how our game Saber Blood is being played. I'm especially excited to be able to do that because I am the author of all the game rules and mechanics, so I'm really eager to hear your feedback. How do you like our game? I'm going to show you all the basic game rules and mechanics. All the advanced ones you can read in our instruction manual. Please also note that what you can see here is the prototype version of our game, and our final product will be of even better quality than what you can see here. Okay, so let's get started. Saber Blood, the board game, is a two-player game that can be played up to 4 players with the additional factions that can be unlocked during our Kickstarter campaign. The game takes about 20 to 60 minutes to play, depending on the playstyle of the players, the scenario they decided to play, and other random factors. At the beginning of the game, each player decides which faction he wishes to play. In the core set we have the Polish nobles and the Zaporozhian Cossacks. Each band comes with 3 characters, each has his own character sheet, and also a unique miniature associated to that character. Each faction also comes with their own unique deck of command cards that are used to move your characters on the board, attack with them, and perform other types of effects in the game. The game takes place on a 8x8 board, which also comes with its unique deck of location cards. Each location in the game, and there will be new unlockable locations through the Kickstarter campaign, will also come with its unique deck of cards. We also have some tokens, and also very important, our custom fencing dice. Each player has his own set that their function I will explain later on. We also have a d6 to represent the amount of command points the player have. One important thing to realize when you start to learn how to play Saber Blood, the board game, is that it plays very much like a card game, in the sense that whatever you want to do in the game, you have to do it by playing out command cards from your hand. Whatever you want to do, either to move or to attack your opponent, you have to do it by playing cards from your hand. There is virtually almost no way to do anything in this game without playing cards. So in a sense, it's a card game in which you see the result of the card you're playing on the board, and what's happening on the board determines, or should determine, what cards are you playing and in what order and what strategy, considering your cards on your hand, will you assume. So that's something important to remember when we get into the finer details of our game rules. At the beginning of the game, players decide which scenario they want to play. All the scenarios are described in our instruction manual. Then they decide which factions they want to play with. Next, player decides who has initiative during the first turn. During the first turn, the player with the longer mustache receives initiative. Or alternatively, if you want to do it more random, you can simply take a d6 and the player with the higher score receives initiative. In order to mark that the player has initiative, you simply take the initiative token and place it somewhere in that player's play area. Next, depending on the scenario the players decided to play, they take their miniatures and they place them on the squares determined by the scenario they decided to play. I am just placing them right now in random squares just to show you an example. Each player also prepares the character sheets for play. Onto each character sheets, players put 1 activation token with the green side up, and also an amount of special point tokens equal to the number in the right bottom corner of the character sheet. So this one has 1, so I put 1 special point token onto this character. Finally, each player draws 5 cards from the deck of command cards. They look at them, and then, starting with the player with initiative, they decide whether to keep their hand or to draw a new one. If they decide to draw a new hand, they simply take the cards, shuffle them back into their deck of cards, and draw a new hand of 5 cards. The second hand they have to keep. Now the game begins. The game takes place in turns. Each turn consists of 3 phases: the regaining of command points phase, the acting phase, and the cleaning up and drawing cards phase. During the first phase, the regaining of command points phase, each player takes their command points dice and places them to the value of 6. This is the basic value each player gets at the beginning of the turn during the first phase. Some game effects may lower this value and some make it even higher, but with no other game effects in play, this value is always 6, and this is the value players get for their first turn. Command points are used later on during the turn to play out command cards. During the acting phase, the player with the initiative token becomes the first active player. Let's assume it is me this turn. An active player may perform one of two operations. He may either play out a card from his hand or decide to pass. If he chooses to play out a card, he simply chooses a card, pays its command point cost printed in the upper right corner of the card, and plays out its effect. If he decides to pass, then the next player, so this time my opponent, becomes the active player and may either choose to play out a card or to pass. If he decides to play out a card, then I again become the active player and I may again make a choice either to play out a card or to pass. If I decide to pass, then again my opponent becomes the active player. This goes on back and forth until we both, one after another, decide to pass. If this happens, if I decide to pass and my opponent decides to pass, then we have no other opportunities to play cards and this phase immediately ends. In the third phase, the cleaning up and drawing cards phase, first we start by discarding all the cards that have their effect last until the end of turn. So for instance, we will take a card like this and put it into the discard pile of its owner. Then each player draws cards. Players draw cards equal to the number of command points that they have left for the turn, but not more than the amount of characters they have still in play plus 1. So for me and my opponent, it's 4 because we both have 3 characters plus 1 equals 4. So I will draw 4 cards. My opponent has 5 command points left during this turn, but he may only draw 4 because that is his limit. So he would, although he has 5 points, he would only draw 4 cards. Also, during drawing cards, you may decide to resign to draw 1 card from a deck of command cards and instead choose to draw 1 card from the deck of location cards. You may only choose to draw 1 card this way. So either you draw, for instance this turn, 4 cards from deck of command cards, or 3 cards from your deck of command cards and 1 card from the deck of location cards. After drawing cards, the limit of cards you may have on your hand is 7. So at this point during the turn, if you have more than 7 cards in your hand, you would have to discard. Luckily, I have only 6. At any other point during a turn, you may have more than 7 cards in your hand, only this time you have to discard to 7. After drawing cards, the initiative token is passed on to the next player, so he will become the first active player in the next turn, and the turn ends and a new turn begins. In Saber Blood there are 3 types of command cards: action cards, stance cards, and interference cards. Action cards are used to perform actions with your characters. You can use them to move your characters, attack with them, shoot a pistol, or push somebody into the fire. After you played an action card and paid its cost, choose one of your characters that hasn't performed an action this turn and apply its effect to that character. For instance, move him and attack with him. Each character may only perform 1 action during a turn. After you perform an action with your character, take the activation token and flip it to the back side, to the red side, to remember that this character already has performed an action and may not perform any more actions this turn. Some action cards allow you to perform actions with your opponent's characters. Those cards state that specific in their text. If you perform an action with your opponent's character, he also has to flip his activation token to the back side, because no matter who performed the action with whose character, only 1 action per character is allowed per turn. Let me show you an example of playing an action card. I choose the card Quick Strike, I pay the cost of 1 command point, and I choose Jan Kremski to perform this action. So this action states 2 movement points, 1 attack. So I take my miniature and I move it 2 movement points, 1, 2, and I choose to perform an attack against my opponent. And combat will start, which I'm going to get into later. After I perform the action with my character, I flip the activation token to its backside to remember that Jan already has performed an action and he may not perform any more action during this turn, and I take the card and discard it to my discard pile. Stance cards represent stances that characters assume during combat. For instance, they may get more defensive or offensive, or as this card suggests, this character starts to be very rude and push people around. Stance cards give characters some additional bonus effects that stay with them as long as the stance card is attached onto each character. Only one stance card can be played during a turn. When you play out a stance card, choose one of your characters that hasn't been targeted by a stance card this turn, and place the card underneath the character sheet in the appropriate space. From this moment on, the effect of the stance card applies to this character. For instance, this card says, gain additionally push 1 to every action. So, this character, every time he performs an action, gets additionally to push 1 an opponent's character. The stance card remains attached to the character as long as no new stance card will be played onto that character. If anyone, me or my opponent, would play a new stance card onto this character, the previous one would fall off and the new one would take its place. But remember, only one stance card per turn. So if I play the stance on my character, no one else, not me, not my opponent, may play an additional stance card onto that character this turn. The next is okay. Some stance cards may have a condition that states when to discard also the card. But if it's not present, the only way to get rid of a stance card is by either playing a different stance card onto that character, or by a card that allows you to discard a stance card from a character. Some stance cards state that they might be played or have to be played onto an opponent's character. Those cards always indicated directly in their card text. Interference cards are the most versatile type of cards. There is absolutely no limit of how many interference cards you may play during a turn, and onto each character, any number of interference cards can be played during a turn. Interference cards do not have a clear target as the stance and action cards have that target always characters. Interference cards always state in their text their target and the effect they have on the game. For example, I want to play the interference card Fall. It costs me 1 command point, and the text says, choose an opponent's character. He receives weaken 1 and slow 1. So, I choose Samuel the Black as the target of my interference card. I want him to have a really bad fall and weaken him in combat. So, as the card states, I will give him 1 weaken and 1 slow token, so he won't be so dangerous in combat anymore. After I play the card, I discard it to my discard pile. Playing interference cards do not influence the limit of 1 action and 1 stance per turn. Some interference cards remain attached to characters. If an interference card states that it remains attached to a character, simply put the card in the appropriate place underneath the character sheet. There is no limit of how many interference cards may be attached to a character, and the next interference card does not remove the previous one, as it is the case with stance cards. Some interference cards state that they remain in play. If they do, simply put them next to the board, and the effect of the card remains active as long as the card remains in play next to the board. These types of cards always state when their effect ends and when to discard them. Some command cards, as you may have noticed, have an additional number printed in the lower right corner. This is the so-called special point cost. This is an additional cost you have to pay with your characters if you want to play this card. So for instance, this card costs 2 command points and additionally 2 special points to be played onto a character. So if I would like to play this card, Finesse Strike, onto my character, I would have to pay the 2 command point cost, so it would reduce me to 0, and additionally 2 special points from my character. So for instance, if I would target Jeremiasz Zuchowski with this card, I would have to spend all of his points, because he has only 2 right now, all of his special points, to be able to execute this action with Jeremiasz. If a card requires you to pay the special points cost in order to play the card, you may not play the card onto a character that has insufficient special points to pay the card's cost. Command cards with special points are usually more powerful than cards without them. Some cards have an optional special points cost printed onto that card. So for instance, this card costs 2 command points, and I may pay 1 special point from my character onto which this card is played to get an additional effect. This card states charge, action, 3 movement points, 1 attack. That is what I get for my 2 command points. But it also says Fury 1, Bolster 1. So if I pay the additional cost of one special point, I also get to this action Bolster 1. And I only may pay this cost when I'm playing this card. I cannot decide while performing this action to pay the extra cost. I have to decide when I'm playing this card whether to pay the cost or not. It's important to note that although all factions have special points, they are called differently. For instance, the Polish nobles call their special points Fantasy, and the Zaporozhian Cossacks call them Fury. And they are also acquired in different ways, but we will get into that a little bit later. Each command card, whether it is an action card, stance card, or interference card, may also be played as a so-called standard action. In order to play a card as a standard action, simply choose one of your cards, ignore all the text on the card and discard it, pay 1 command point, and perform with one of your characters, who still may perform an action, one of these 3 types of actions, either 2 movement points, or 1 movement point and 1 attack, or the character becomes ready. The ready effect is simply saying that the character stands ready for an attack, and if an opponent character moves to an adjacent space, this character might attack him before he does. This effect is in detail described in our instruction manual. So the standard action simply means that each card in your hand may be either played according to its effect that is printed on the card, or alternatively as a standard action. The standard action of course counts to the limit of actions a character may perform during a turn. There is a huge variety of effects that are printed on the command cards. Please refer to our instruction manual for the precise description. Characters move around the board by spending movement points. They gain movement points from command cards that are played upon them. Moving to any free adjacent space costs always 1 movement point. The characters may move horizontally or diagonally. Characters may not move through other characters, whether they are friendly or foe. On each board there are special tiles that follow some unique rules. In the tavern we have a few special tiles. First of all, we have so-called obstacles, like barrels, wardrobes, and this bar counter. Obstacles may always be crossed by characters by spending movement points, but no character may ever end their movement on an obstacle. So, for instance, this character may move 2 movement points through these barrels, but may not spend only 1 movement point to end its movement on a barrel. Also, no character may be pushed in a way. For instance, this character would use a push effect from some command cards to push this character. No character may be pushed in a way that would end its movement on an obstacle. So for instance, if this character could only push 1 square, this character, he may not do it because it would end his movement on the barrels. But if he would be able to push him for two spaces, like 1, 2, then it's legal. The second type of special squares in the tavern are the 4 pillars of the tavern. They are simply spaces that are inaccessible to any miniatures. So no miniature may ever move onto a space with a pillar, move through such a space, or be pushed onto or pushed through or moved onto or moved through a space with a pillar. The last type of a special square in the tavern is the square with the fireplace. No miniature may move onto the square with the fireplace by spending movement points, or move through the square with the fireplace. So if I have 2 movement points, I would have to go around the fireplace. I cannot go through it, and of course I cannot go into it and stay there. Although characters cannot enter the fireplace by spending movement points, they may be pushed into the fireplace or be moved into the fireplace. If this happens, so if a character is pushed into the fireplace, he immediately receives 1 wound, and the player whose character it is has to immediately take the character and place it onto a free adjacent space to the fireplace. A character only receives this wound if he is moved into the fireplace or pushed into, and he ends his movement there. If he is only being pushed through the fireplace or if he is being moved through the fireplace, he doesn't suffer the wound. Other terrain features, like for instance tables, do not have any specific game effects. In some scenarios there are some special rules that do give them some special effects. When one character attacks another opponent's character, combat begins. In order to attack an opponent's character, you simply choose an opponent's character that is on an adjacent space to you, whether it is horizontal or diagonal, and declare him as the target of your attack. In order to play out the combat, we need our fencing dice. There are 2 types of fencing dice. We have the fencing stance dice, the attack stance dice, the feint stance dice, and the dodge stance dice. And we have our fencing skill dice, the low skill dice, the medium skill dice, the high skill dice, and the master skill dice. The fencing skill dice represent how well does a character fight with his saber during that combat. The fencing stance dice represent what kind of stance does the character assume during that combat. Is he trying to directly attack his opponent and land a killing blow? Is he trying to feint, trick his opponent into thinking that he is going to attack from one side and he really is planning to attack from a whole other different side? Or whether he is trying to dodge the attack and launch a counterattack. Each player has his own set of fencing dice. At the beginning of combat, each player takes his 3 stance dice and secretly chooses 1 stance die to represent which stance is his character going to assume during this combat. So for instance, one player will choose the attack stance and the other player might choose the dodge stance. They both choose them secretly and reveal them simultaneously when they say that they are ready. The choices are very important because the fencing stance dice have advantage over one another. Much like in the game rock, paper, scissors, the stance dice have a similar type of advantages over one another. The attack dice has advantage over the feint die. The feint die has advantage over the dodge die, and the dodge die has advantage over the attack die. So the dodge stance has advantage over the attack stance simply because somebody is trying to attack you. You predict the attack, parry it or dodge it, and you can launch an effective counterattack. The attack stance has advantage over the feint stance simply because somebody is only feinting an attack and you don't fall for it, attack him right back, which gives you the advantage. The feint stance has advantage over the dodge stance because you are feinting an attack, somebody falls for it, tries to dodge it or parry it, which gets him into a position you wanted him to be from the start, and you have an advantageous opportunity to attack him. So this is how the relationship between these 3 dice looks like. These represent the advantage symbols. When you roll these dice, these symbols only count when your dice has advantage or your stance has advantage over the opponent's stance. Each of these symbols give you +1 to your combat result, but only if you roll the dice with advantage. So for instance, if one player rolls the attack dice when his opponent rolls his feint dice, he will count his advantage symbols to his combat result and his opponent won't. So for instance, in a roll like this, this player will have 2 additional points to his combat result, and this will get no additional points because his dice does not have advantage over the attack dice, and the attack dice has advantage over the feint die. So these symbols only count when you have an advantage. If you have disadvantage, or If both players roll the same dice, this symbol do not count to the combat result. When both players have decided which fencing stance die they're going to choose for this combat, you have to choose the appropriate fencing skill dice to the fencing stance dice. In order to do that, you have to take the character sheet of the character you are fighting with, in this case Jeremiasz Zuchowski, and I look at his character sheet, and we can see here 3 dices with 3 colors that represent the 3 stances underneath them. This is the attack stance, this is the dodge stance, this is the feint stance. And each character has a basic skill value associated to all the 3 stances. So characters fight with different skill in all the 3 stances. For instance, Jeremiasz has a medium skill on fighting with the attack stance, but high on the dodge and the feint stance. So he's a really good fighter when he's fighting in the feint and dodge stance, and a quite good fighter when he's fighting in the attack stance. So, if I'm fighting with Jeremiasz, and I have chosen the attack stance, I take the medium skill dice to roll with my attack stance. My opponent is Samuel the Black, and he has a high skill on the attack dice, a medium skill on the dodge die, and a high skill on the feint stance die. So he has chosen the feint stance, so he is going to choose the high skill dice to throw with his feint stance. So when both players have chosen their dice to roll, they take their 2 dice and they roll them simultaneously. And they check the result of their throws. So this is the result of Samuel's throw, and this is the result of Jeremiasz's throw. In order to determine the combat result, we simply add together the points on both dice. So for Jeremiasz it will be 4 on his skill die and 2 on his attack die, because his dice has advantage over the feint die. And Samuel's throw will be 1 point on the skill die and 0 on the feint die, because his advantage symbols do not count because his dice doesn't have advantage over the opponent's dice. So the combat score of Jeremiasz is 6 and of Samuel sadly only 1. So Jeremiasz won the combat and deals 1 wound to Samuel the Black. When a character wins combat with an opponent's character, he deals 1 wound to the opponent's character, regardless of which combat stance he chose to fight with. Even if he fights with the dodge die and he would win, of course in this scenario he wouldn't, because it would be 4 plus 0 and 1 plus 3 because the feint dice has advantage over the dodge die. But let's assume that the throw looks like this, so 3 to 4. Then even if somebody is throwing the dodge die, he also deals 1 wound to the opponent's character. Each dice, besides the advantage symbols, has also on them the so-called special symbols and the unique symbols. And let me explain to you what do they do. The special symbols on the attack die, the so-called extra wound symbols, simply means that when the character who's using this stance wins combat with his opponent, he deals 1 extra wound for each special extra wound symbol. So for instance, if Jeremiasz would fight with the attack stance against an opponent who would fight with the dodge stance, and let's give him even the advantage, so he has 3 points and Jeremiasz would have 4. So if Jeremiasz would win combat in this way, he would deal 1 wound for winning combat and 2 extra wounds for the special symbols. The unique symbol on the attack die is the so-called strike symbol. This symbol means that this character will deal 1 wound to his opponent's character regardless of the combat result. So for instance, if Jeremiasz's score would be 2 and his opponent's, let's say, 5, then Jeremiasz would lose combat, but although he has lost combat, he would still do 1 wound to his opponent, but also he would suffer 1 wound because his opponent has won combat with him. Jeremias would also deal this wound if the combat result would be a tie. So, for instance, the combat result would look like this. Also, in case of a tie, nobody receives a wound, but this time Jeremias would still deal one wound to his opponent. The special symbol on the dodge die is the dodge symbol. For each such symbol, a character receives one less wound during this combat. So, for instance, if the combat result would look like this, so Jeremias' score would be 5 plus 0 because he doesn't have advantage, against his opponent 2 plus 0, then Jeremias would normally do 2 wounds. 1 wound for winning combat and 1 additional wound from the extra wound symbol. But Samuel has thrown 2 dodge symbols, reducing the number of wounds he receives by 2, so he would receive no wounds during this combat. The unique symbol on the dodge die is the so-called evade symbol. If this symbol is rolled, the combat immediately ends in a tie. So regardless of the combat result, let's say that the combat result would look like this. So 2 for Jeremias and 5 for Samuel. Although Samuel has won the combat, because of the evade symbol, the combat immediately ends and no character deals any wounds to the other characters. The special symbols on the feint die are so-called rerolls. The effect of the reroll symbols are used after the rolls have been made. So for instance, in such a scenario, which is very bad for Samuel, he would lose combat and suffer 3 wounds because 1 for losing combat and 2 extra wounds from the attack die. But he has 2 reroll symbols, so he may choose 2 dice to be rerolled during this combat, but each die only once. So for instance, he may choose to force Jeremias to reroll his skill die and then choose to reroll his skill die. Now, this combat result is much better for Samuel. He wins combat and he doesn't suffer any wounds from Jeremias because the extra wound symbols only work when the character wins combat. So Samuel would do 1 wound to his opponent and would suffer no wounds from his opponent. The unique symbol on the feint die is the change symbol. The effect of the change symbol is simple. After both players have rolled their dice, the player who has the change symbol may choose any dice that has been rolled and change it to any other value. For instance, in this situation, Samuel has won combat by 1 point, 2-1, but his opponent has 2 dodge symbols, so Samuel wouldn't do any wounds to him. So he decides to change this dice to this value, giving Jeremias still only 1 point because this advantage symbol do not count when his opponent is rolling the feint dice. So this time Samuel also wins combat, but Jeremias has no dodge symbols, so he will suffer the wound from Samuel. Also, the dodge die and the feint die have some special effects when you win combat using them. If you win using the dodge stance, regardless of you having dealt any wound to your opponent or not, you may move your character 1 space. So for instance, you could move him here, here, or here. If you win combat using the feint dice, you can move your opponent's character 1 space, again regardless of you having dealt any wounds during this combat. So for instance, you could move Samuel here, here, or even you could move him into the fireplace, dealing him 1 wound. Winning with the attack stance doesn't give you any additional bonus effects for winning combat with this stance. When one character attacks another character, only they are considered to be in combat, but other characters may support their friendly characters in that combat. In order to support a friendly character, a character must stand adjacent to the opponent's character that is in combat, but not adjacent to any other opponent's character. So in this case, this character may support his friendly character in the fight with the opponent's character because he stands adjacent to him. he might do it also by standing here, for instance. But if a opponent's character would stand anywhere adjacent to him, like here, here, or even here, then he may not support, because although he is adjacent to the opponent's character that is in combat, he also stands adjacent to a different opponent's character that is not in that combat. Multiple characters may support in combat, but they all have to be adjacent to the opponent's character and not adjacent to any other opponent's character. So this character may support Samuel in the fight with Jeremiasz by standing here or here, but he may not support when he's standing here or here, because then he stands adjacent to another opponent's character, or of course here, because then he also stands adjacent to this opponent's character. Of course, in this scenario where Samuel and Jeremiasz are fighting, none of these characters may support, because these three characters each block themselves out from supporting. This character blocks these two characters from attacking his friendly character, and these two characters block this character from attacking their friendly character. At the beginning of combat, a character that receives support from his friendly characters receives bolster 1 for each supporting character. So in a scenario like this, where Samuel would be supported by one friendly character, he would receive 1 bolster token for 1 friendly character's support. If he would have another friendly character supporting him, he would receive 2 bolster tokens. 2 important effects when we talk about combat are the bolster and weaken effects. The bolster and weaken effects affect the level of skill dice you use during combat. For each bolster a character has, he throws his skill dice of 1 level higher than they are printed on his character sheet. So for instance, if Samuel would choose the attack stance, he would normally choose the high skill die, but because he has a bolster effect, a 1 bolster token, he would throw the master skill dice together with his attack stance. If he would choose the dodge stance, he would throw normally the medium skill dice, but because he has the bolster token, he would now choose the high skill dice. Now the opposite is true for the weaken token. For each weaken token, the character chooses 1 level lower his skill dice than what is printed on his character sheet. So for instance, with the dodge stance, he would choose the low skill die instead of the medium skill die. For the feint stance, he would choose the medium skill die instead of the high skill die. Any character may have any number of weaken or bolster tokens. So for instance, Samuel may have 2 weaken tokens, resulting in him throwing each stance with the lowest skill die. He may also have 2 bolster tokens, resulting him throwing each stance with the master skill die. Any effect that would rise the skill die above the master or lower it beneath the low skill die is simply ignored. But the characters may have more bolster tokens than is required for them to choose the highest, or have more weaken tokens than it is required for them to throw the lower skill die. Each bolster token and each weaken token negate each other out. So if a character receives a weaken token when he has a bolster token, simply take both of them and discard them. One important thing to mention here is that the dice are so balanced that whatever combination of dice you and your opponents are throwing, for instance, if your opponent is throwing the master skill dice with the feint die and you are throwing the dodge die with the lowest skill dice, so he has the highest skill dice and he has advantage over your die, then although he has an incredibly high chance of winning combat with you, there is always a possibility for you to win. So there is always a combination on any dice that even in the worst case scenario, you still may win combat. One more important strategy tip is that it is usually far more important to choose the advantageous stance die than to choose the die that gives you the highest skill die, because throwing even the lowest skill die with the advantageous stance die is similarly powerful and can be even sometimes better than throwing the master skill die with the less advantageous stance. So for instance, in a throw like this, you see that the lowest skill die with the advantageous die gave you a score of 5, and this throw gave a score only of 4. So sometimes it is really good to try to outsmart your opponent and tricking him into believing that you are going to choose one die when you're really going to choose another one. So it really becomes, in a sense, a game of tactics and deceit when two good players are playing against one another. Each character has a life total printed in the upper right corner. When a character takes wounds, simply put wound tokens onto the character sheet. When a character receives wounds equal to his life total, he becomes immediately eliminated from the game. Each character also has a special ability that is active until the character is not defeated. For instance, Samuel the Black has a special ability. If he has an alcohol card attached to him, he receives bolster 1 at the start of each combat. So Samuel becomes a really fierce warrior when he's a little bit drunk. Each character also has a number of special points he starts the game with. Samuel has 1 point. This is not the maximum amount of points, it only indicates how much points a character has at the beginning of the game. There is no maximum amount of points a character may have. Each faction has special points, but they are called differently. The Polish nobles call their special points fantasy, and the Zaporozhian Cossacks call their special points fury, and they are also spent and acquired in different ways. Polish nobles have as their special points fantasy. They were known for very extravagant behavior. They like to show off, do behaviors that were over the top, just to show how wealthy, how smart, or how brave they were. Polish nobles gained fantasy points by spending their command points. The less command points they have, so the more they did during a turn, the more fantasy points they get. So if they have 4 command points left, they get 1 special point. If they have 2 command points left, they get 2 special points. And if they have no command points left, they get 3 special points to distribute in any way among their characters. The fantasy points of the Polish nobles may be spent either to pay for the special points cost on command cards, or each time you play an action or stance card onto a Polish noble, you may decrease the cost of command points by spending special points. So for instance, instead of paying 2 command points for this card, you may choose to pay 1 command point and 1 special point, or even pay the whole cost in special points. So this way you may spare your command points and do even more things during a turn with your Polish nobles. You can do this only for action cards and stance cards, and only the character onto which the card is played may reduce the cost by spending his special points. You may not pay with your special points for another character. The Zaporozhian Cossacks have as their special points Fury, and they are the best fighters in the game. Cossacks were known for their fighting skills and fierce temper in battle. To represent this, they gain Fury points by receiving or dealing wounds in combat. Each time a Zaporozhian Cossack deals or receives a wound in combat, he gets that many Fury points. So for instance, if he would deal 2 wounds and receive 1 wound, which is possible due to the strike symbol on the attack die, he would receive 3 Fury points, 2 for dealt wounds and 1 for 1 received wound. The Zaporozhian Cossacks are really eager to get into a fight, so they can spend their Fury points, as always, of course, to pay the special point cost on command cards, but they may also use the special points to give themselves +1 movement point to the action they are currently playing out. They may spend as much as they want of their special points. So for instance, if a character would have 4 special points, he might add even 4 movement points to his action. But remember, you may only add the additional movement points to a action. You may not add it to any other type of movement, for instance, from an interference card. Of course, you may add the additional movement points to a standard action. So, this is the end of how to play Saber and Blood. I hope you enjoyed this movie and you learned how to play our game. For all the advanced rules clarifications, and explanations of all the effects on the command card, please read our instruction manual. If you enjoyed this movie, please click the like button, subscribe to our channel, and of course share this video with others so more people can hear about Saber and Blood. And of course leave a comment so we can hear from you how do you like our game. I'm especially eager to hear your feedback. So, thanks for watching and see you in the next video.